All right, so you guys know I love a good horror flick and vampires. Well, they're kind of my thing. You sent in a review of the 2024 Nosferatu, and, well, I gotta know what makes this one stand out, especially with a score of 8.5 out of 10. I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah, 8.5 is pretty huge. And this isn't some teen vampire romance either. This is Robert Eggers we're talking about. The guy's a master of atmosphere.
Oh, yeah, I love The Witch in the Lighthouse. So creepy, so well made. But what's he doing with Nosferatu? Isn't that, like, a silent film from forever ago?
Right, 1922. But Eggers is a total film nerd. He's weaving in elements from that original Nosferatu, but also from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. And get this, he set it in 19th century Germany.
Germany, huh? Interesting choice. Yeah. So we're not dealing with sparkly vampires here. What's the vibe?
Think Gothic horror meets historical authenticity. The reviewer talks about how Eggers really digs into the anxieties of that era, the social and technological changes happening. So it's not just a monster movie, it's making you think.
I'm intrigued already. Okay, so link setting, legendary director. But we got to talk about the vampire himself, Bill Skarsgård, as Count Orlok. I mean, the guy can make anything scary. What's the word on his performance?
Oh, the reviewer uses words like chilling, but it's more like predatory, they say. Skarsgård totally disappears into the role. He's got this gaunt, rat-like look, unsettling movements. They even compare him to Max Schreck from the original Nosferatu.
Wow, high praise. I mean, Skarsgård really knows how to get under your skin. I'm still recovering from Pennywise. So we've got unsettling vibes, a master director, and a creepy lead. Who else is in this thing?
Well, Lily Rose Depp and Nicholas Hoult are the other big names. Depp plays Ellen, who's described as fragile yet strong, so not just a damsel in distress, thankfully.
Thank goodness for that. I'm so tired of the helpless female characters in horror movies. What about Hoult?
He's hotter, and he starts out kind of naive, but then descends into paranoia as the story unfolds.
Oh, I love those descent into madness stories. That slow burn can be more terrifying than any jump scare. But speaking of slow burn, how does Eggers' style work with this kind of story? He's known for being pretty deliberate, right?
Exactly. The reviewer talks about his meticulous direction, that blend of Gothic horror and historical authenticity I mentioned. And yeah, they use the phrase oppressive atmosphere, a sense of dread in every frame. Oh, and they call the overall tone unrelentingly bleak.
So not exactly a feel-good movie, then.
Not unless you find bleakness comforting.
Well, bleak can be beautiful, you know. I'm thinking those classic black and white horror films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, that kind of thing. Visually, is there anything like that going on here?
You hit the nail on the head. The reviewer talks about these moments of surreal beauty, like they specifically mention Orlok's shadow creeping up a staircase, and it's juxtaposed with, like, the grotesque horror of plague-ridden townsfolk. So yeah, visually stunning, but in a very unsettling way.
Okay, I'm getting chills just picturing it. But we've talked a lot about the look and feel. What about the story itself? Does it stick to the traditional vampire tropes, or does it dig a little deeper? Like, what's the point of it all?
Well, it's got those classic themes of obsession, decay, the supernatural. But the reviewer suggests that Eggers is using those to explore bigger ideas like anxieties about societal collapse.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Especially given the setting, 19th century Germany, the Industrial Revolution, all that upheaval. People were dealing with huge changes, fear of disease. Sound familiar?
Yeah, it does, actually. It's like the vampire becomes a metaphor for all these fears we have about the world falling apart. But before we spiraled too far down that rabbit hole, were there any criticisms mentioned? Anything that might make someone think twice about watching?
A couple of things. The pacing, especially in the first act, is pretty slow.
Okay, so maybe not for the ADHD crowd.
And the story itself doesn't really deviate from the original Nosferatu. So not a lot of surprises there.
So if you're a diehard fan of the original, maybe you'll be like, been there, done that. Got it. Anything else?
Oh, one more thing. The reviewer said the film's pretty cold, emotionally distant.
Ah, so not a tearjerker. More like an art house horror film. Which, honestly, knowing Eggers, I'm not surprised. But the reviewer also mentioned something about German Expressionism.
Right. They talked about the cinematography specifically, those stark contrasts of light and shadow. Eggers is really using those techniques to create unease, a sense of distorted reality. It's like the world itself is warping around the characters.
Whoa, okay, I'm really getting a sense of how visually powerful this must be. What about the music? Does that add to the creep factor?
Oh, absolutely. The reviewer praised Mark Corvin's score, said it's full of eerie strings and discordant tones. Think screeching violins and industrial sounds. Not exactly a relaxing soundtrack.
Definitely not putting that on my chill-out playlist. So we've got incredible visuals, unsettling music, Skarsgård bringing the creepiness. What really sets this apart from other horror films, though? The reviewer hinted at something.
Well, nowadays, everything's CGI, right? But the reviewer specifically called out the practical effects, especially with Orlok's design. It's like old-school monster movie magic, and they said it's really effective.
Practical effects just hit different, don't they? There's something so much more tangible, so much more real about them. And speaking of real, the reviewer mentioned Willem Dafoe is in the film.
Yeah, he plays a professor.
Hold on. This is getting way too interesting to cram into one part. We got to save Willem Dafoe and this professor character for part 2. Don't want to spoil all the fun just yet.
So Willem Dafoe, right? He plays this character, Professor Bulwer, and he's like a scholar of folklore, the occult, all that spooky stuff.
Okay, so we're not just dealing with the spooky vibes here, but like actual folklore and historical context, I bet Dafoe just eats up a role like that. Perfect casting. But how does this professor character fit into the whole vampire thing? Is he out there battling the undead, or is he more of a researcher?
Well, the review doesn't really give us all the gory details, but they do mention that Bulwer provides some crucial exposition about vampire lore, and the history of Nosferatu. He seems to be more of a guide for the audience, helps us understand what we're dealing with.
So kind of like a Van Helsing,
Yeah.
but less action hero and more like a walking encyclopedia of all things creepy.
Exactly. Like Eggers is saying, hey, this isn't just a monster movie. These creatures have a history, a mythology that people have believed in for centuries. It adds another layer to the film,
Yeah. It's like that academic context makes the unbelievable feel more, believable, which makes me think we're all kind of fascinated by that dark side of history, right? The unexplained, the creepy stuff. But speaking of history, you keep mentioning German Expressionism. The cinematography has that style, you said.
Mm-hmm.
But what does that even mean for someone who's not an art history buff?
Think back to those old black and white horror films, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Remember those distorted sets, the buildings that seem to lean in on the characters, and the shadows, those dramatic shadows? That's German Expressionism. It's not about showing reality. It's about expressing inner emotions, psychological states, through the visuals.
Okay, so it's all about the mood, the atmosphere, using those visuals to make you feel trapped, claustrophobic, a little paranoid even.
Exactly. And the reviewer highlights how Eggers uses light and shadow in Nosferatu to create that same sense of unease. Imagine long, looming shadows, cramped interiors, and these unsettling camera angles that make you question what you're seeing.
Okay, now that is creepy, and I bet the sound design adds to that too. You mentioned those eerie strings and discordant tones. Sounds like a recipe for nightmares.
Oh, yeah. Think about those creaking floorboards, the howling wind, and then those unsettling musical cues on top of it all. It all works together to get under your skin.
So we've talked about the artistic side of things, but what about the message? What's Eggers trying to say with this reimagining of Nosferatu? Is it deeper than just scaring the audience?
That's the question, isn't it? Remember those themes we mentioned, obsession, decay, the supernatural. They're not just there for shock value. The film seems to be exploring those themes in a way that's relevant to us today.
It's interesting, this whole idea of a vampire, someone who feeds on others to survive. It's a pretty powerful metaphor, right? For how we can be consumed by our own desires, our anxieties, especially in a world that feels so uncertain right now. That theme of decay hits differently.
Totally. The film's set during a time of massive upheaval, and those anxieties are reflected in the story. But there are anxieties too, Pandemics, climate change, social unrest. It's like the film is holding up a mirror to our fears about the world, how fragile it all is.
Whoa, okay. Deep thoughts here. But you're right. Horror movies, they can be more than just entertainment. They can tap into those collective anxieties, force us to confront them.
Right. And by engaging with those dark themes through art, we can learn something about ourselves, about the world around us.
It's like a safe way to explore those dark corners of our minds, face our fears, without actually being in danger. But speaking of facing fears, let's circle back to Bill Skarsgård. The reviewer was really impressed with his performance as Orlok. What did they say exactly?
They called it transformative. Yeah. It's not just about looking scary. It's about conveying that ancient evil, that predatory instinct, And they said a lot of it comes from his physicality, the gauntness, the way he moves. Remember, they even compared him to Max Schreck, the original Orlok.
Yeah, I can't imagine how much work goes into embodying a character like that. It's not just putting on a costume. It's about disappearing into the role, becoming something otherworldly.
And Skarsgård, well, he's known for transforming himself for roles like With Pennywise, right. And now he's taking on this iconic vampire. It's exciting to see how he makes the role his own.
It sounds like he really nailed it. Definitely a performance I got to see. But before we get too carried away with the praise, we should probably mention those criticisms again, just so folks know what they might be getting into.
Right. Well, the pacing, for one, they called it deliberate, especially in the first act. Might be too slow for some viewers.
Okay, so not for the action junkies. But, like I said before, I actually prefer slow burn horror. Give you time to soak in the atmosphere.
Totally. And they also mention the story sticks pretty closely to the original Nosferatu, so not a lot of surprises there.
So if you're hoping for a totally new take on the vampire myth, this might not be it. But I think there's something to be said for a good adaptation that honors the source material while also bringing something fresh to the table. What else?
The last thing was the emotional tone. They said it's pretty cold, clinical, not a very character-driven emotional experience.
Right. Not a tearjerker, more of an art house horror film, which, honestly, knowing Eggers, I'm not surprised. But we were talking about Professor Bulwer, the occult expert. Well, it got me thinking, what if he's more than just an expert on folklore? What if he represents the audience, our fascination with the macabre, our desire to understand those dark things that both repel us and attract us?
Ooh, now that's a good point. That's definitely worth unpacking.
So we were saying that Professor Bulwer might represent more than just a, folklore expert.
Yeah, like he's us, the audience. He's fascinated by all this creepy stuff, these dark corners of history and mythology. And in a way, we all kind of are, right?
It's true. We watch all those true crime documentaries, read spooky books, tell ghost stories. Why are we so drawn to the dark stuff?
It's like we want to test our limits, see how much we can handle. Horror movies are perfect for that. Safe way to get spooked.
Right, like a controlled dose of fear. And Nosferatu, with all its themes of, obsession, decay, all that, it really amplifies those anxieties.
Yeah, and don't forget the historical setting, right? 19th century Germany, all those huge changes happening, the Industrial Revolution. People were probably freaking out a bit.
So Eggers is tapping into that and making it relevant for us today. It's like he's saying those fears, those anxieties, they're not new. We've always had them.
And it's interesting how he's using the vampire myth to do that. The vampire, it's a story that keeps coming back,
Because it speaks to something deep inside us, I think. Fear of the unknown, our own mortality, the whole thing.
Exactly. And Eggers, he's giving us a fresh take on that myth, a visually stunning one. He's making us think about those themes in a new way.
So it's not just like a scary movie. It's a film about, what it means to be human, right? Our hopes and fears, the struggle between darkness and light, and all those great reviews suggest it's really hitting home with people.
Oh, absolutely. It's terrifying, but it also makes you think. And as we've been talking about, it brings up some big questions, like how do we deal with our own anxieties, our relationship with, the dark stuff, both inside us and out in the world.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to ponder. So if you're looking for a horror film that'll stick with you, one that'll challenge you, intellectually and emotionally, then definitely check out Nosferatu 2024. Just be prepared for some nightmares.
Sweet dreams.